Get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for signing up and coming to this presentation called Dyslexia and Spelling. I am Kelli Sandman-Hurley. I am the founder of the Dyslexia Training Institute. I am here with Brittany Martinez, who is our program manager and the reason that that we even survive on a day-to-day basis. She'll be in the chat box with me until about 5:15 at the latest. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box, and then I will be peeking at the chat box as we go. I do want to give you a little heads up and be transparent. Sorry, there's something in the question and answer section. I want to make sure I see everything. That I do have a little bit of a cold, so I apologize for the way that I sound, that I'll be clearing my throat and probably coughing, but that's the only time I'm going to apologize through this whole presentation, because as I get older, I tend to apologize less for things that I do that I can't control. So just so you know, I'm aware that I sound a little coldish. So this is a presentation about dyslexia and spelling. What I'm going to do is go through my presentation. I disabled the cameras and all of that because most people turn their cameras off these days anyway. It didn't really make any sense. I had quite a few attendees and I didn't want to get too distracted. So my plan is to get through my presentation. Like I said, Brittany will be in the chat box. I will be checking the chat box briefly now and then. I will be asking you to put some things in the chat box now and then so that we can have some interaction. But I do want to get through my presentation. I'll answer questions at the end. If I do not choose your question, I do not see your question, or maybe I don't think I could answer your question on the spot at the moment, I will look at all of the questions at the end of the presentation and answer them in written form and then send them out to everybody who attended. So don't feel like you're not getting your question answered. Perhaps I just needed more time with it, or maybe I needed to investigate something. Because the title of this presentation is Dyslexia and Spelling, I don't want to give you the idea that I think I know everything about spelling, that you're going to throw some word at me that you think is crazy and that I'm going to be able to answer it for you. That's not really the purpose of this presentation. I'll be able to answer a lot of things, but I'm not going to tell you that I will be able to answer everything. The purpose of this presentation is to give you an idea of why spelling is difficult for students, and then how English is structured so that you as instructors, parents, teachers, psychologists, whatever your role is, can then take that information and use it how you would need to use it for your individual situation. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. I want to tell you just a little bit about DTI. We are accredited at the plus level for our dyslexia certificate program, which means that we certify people in the Orton-Gillingham approach, also a structured literacy approach, all the way through mentorship, and it's all online. So if you're interested in that, we have a program that starts in June and one that starts in one starts in January, one that starts in June. We also have a virtual spring conference, which you have the information right there, and there's a QR code. We currently have the super early bird rate for you. We have online monthly courses and our dyslexia 4-day simulation, among other things that we do. But I just want to give you an idea of who we are, who you're listening to, where we're coming from, and what we're all about. All right, so let's go over the presentation agenda. So how will this presentation differ from most spelling presentations? Well, I'm going to focus on why spelling mistakes. I can't see what's on my slide. I have to move there we go. We'll see on why spelling mistakes are made in an effort to make spelling instruction more intentional. So I look to the language itself for evidence and data about how English works. So a little bit about me is I came from the adult literacy world. I worked at Reed San Diego, which is the adult literacy program in the San Diego Public Library, for 12 years. So I worked with adults who struggled with literacy. That whole time I met hundreds of adults. They all struggled with spelling, and I mean they all struggled with spelling. They all wanted to be better spellers. They all found that spelling did in some way impact their self-esteem, did impact them in getting a job, at some point probably embarrassed them. So I was really interested in spelling. I was also interested in dyslexia. So I went and got my doctorate in dyslexia and literacy. And then 8 years later, I decided, you know what, why not just go back to school? So I went back to school and got my master's degree in linguistics. So this presentation is a combination of all of my experience in dyslexia and working with kids and adults and in linguistics. This presentation is heavy on the linguistics. And so I will get in the weeds a little bit, but the purpose of that is to show you how things are working behind the scenes so that when you have a student who makes a spelling mistake or has a spelling question, you might have a better idea of why that's happening. This presentation will focus on what instructor. That's not spelled right. That's not actually written right. This presentation will focus on instructor knowledge about spelling. Like I said, it's not here's a bunch of practical activities. It's really here's what you need to know about English in order to help your student be a better speller. This should also have a period at the end of it. This will also include a mini course in linguistics to make sure we're all speaking the same language about language. I will stress the importance of the schwa in spelling and reading, and then we'll investigate words with silent letters. And we're also going to take a shallow dive into structured word inquiry at the very end. So if any of you are expecting to see a little structured word inquiry here, you will see that at the end. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them. If you want to jump ship, now's a good time. We're going to start off with the simulation. If you've already done all of my simulations, and you can go ahead and just sit back and watch, but we'll do this rather quickly. So with your piece of paper, what I want you to do is just write the directions to making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But as you do that, you have to spell every single word as it sounds. So if the word is the, it might be THU. If the word is of, it might be UV. There's no right or wrong answer. You just spell it however you want to spell it. I'm going to give you about a minute and a half to do that. So a minute and a half to write the directions to making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but you have to spell every single word just like it sounds. So if someone were to tell you to sound it out, how would you sound it out? So go ahead and start that, and then I'll check in with you in about a minute and change. Okay, I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds. Okay, about 10 more seconds. All right. I'm going to go ahead and have you stop. In the chat box, please put a number 1 if you have the first word misspelled. All right, so we have at least about 10, 11, 12. Okay, so now they're starting to roll in. Okay, put a number 2 if your second word is the first word that's misspelled. And then put a number 3 if you got all the way to the third word before you misspelled something. Okay. I'm not sure I can see everybody. And when you go in the chat box and it says 2 and you have that blue box, make sure you're clicking on everyone before you send out your number. So if I'm reading this correctly, everybody. Oh, you know, just because I know you're right. I did that. I made a mistake. You're right. I clicked the wrong box when I set this up. So it's fine. I can read them. It's fine. All right. So I'm not going to ask you this question that I normally ask because I already know the answer. So how did that work for you? So what is the very first thing we say to a student when they can't spell a word? What do we say? We say, sound it out. Just sound it out. You can spell the word. And I know from experience from doing this simulation in person all the time. In fact, I just did it yesterday with 60 parents. I know that 99% of you, if you actually followed the directions, misspelled a word by the second word. maybe even the first word. So just imagine how frustrating it is to be a student who is probably dyslexic, probably average to above average intelligence. And every single time you do exactly what the teachers, educators, tutors, everybody in your world is telling you to do, you get it wrong. So that is how frustrating spelling is, because we keep telling them to sound it out and they do. They're sounding it out and then they're getting it wrong every time. So just imagine, day after day, year after year, how frustrating that is for a student who has about average to above average intelligence. So, that's why we need to talk about spelling. We need to talk about changing the way we approach spelling instruction and changing the way we speak about spelling to our students and the questions we ask them in order to help them understand why a word is spelled the way that it is, or to get to a good spelling, the right spelling. Having said that, one caveat before I move on is that I'm not here to say that anything I say is going to create a perfect speller. You're not going to get spelling bee spellers just by learning all of this stuff. Most people with dyslexia will struggle with spelling most of their lives, but at least they'll understand it. And at least they'll know there's a reason for it, which is far less frustrating than just thinking that English is crazy. Okay, so when people email me in my advocate role about their student and they want to know if they should get an IEP or an assessment, or they want tutoring, I always say, the very first thing I always say is just send me the spelling sample, send me a writing sample. So send me something the student wrote on their own. And when I get that sample, I already know everything I need to know about what the student understands about the English language. You get so much information from just the writing sample. Okay, so why is spelling so difficult for students with dyslexia and those without dyslexia? Because, like I already said, when a student comes across a word they don't know how to read or spell, the first thing they're taught is to sound it out or use context clues, and that rarely works in English. So I'm going to guess that some of you wrote something close to what you see in red. First, you need a piece of bread, something close to that when you did the simulation at the very beginning. And then we have a really simple sentence like the dog jumped over the moon. If I saw this, I would be like, oh, that's interesting. This student actually has really good phonological awareness because they have every sound accounted for. They heard every sound. They were able to pull out every sound that's in every word in that sentence. What they don't understand is how we represent the meanings and the sounds in English. So first, before we even get started, like I said in my marketing materials, that we are going to dive into linguistics a little bit. So we're going to do a linguistics mini course because we can't teach spelling without an understanding of the inner workings of language. So I just want to share a couple quotes I heard when I was going through my master's program in linguistics. And this was after I'd had DTI for over 14 years and I'd been in the dyslexia world forever, and we'd done Orton Gillingham, and I was really getting into structured word inquiry. And I was sitting in this class, me and, all the 20 somethings and me. And then my professor just flat out said, and linguistics professors are no nonsense. They are scientists at the core. And he just said, you can see a phone, but you cannot see a phoneme. And I really liked this because what I hear a lot in the education world is, oh, they're writing phonetically. They're spelling phonetically. And as someone with linguistics background now, I'm like, no, you can't spell phonetically. That's not a thing. So I will explain what he meant by you can see a phone, but you cannot see a phoneme. And then the other professor said teaching anything about language out of context is a waste of time. Loved it, because what he didn't mean was out of context of guessing. He didn't mean to guess what a word was based on the words around it. He didn't mean to guess based on the picture, which is, if I went to a dyslexia conference and said, you have to teach, you can't teach anything out of context, everyone would freak out and think I was trying to teach whole language, right? But that's not what he's talking about. He was talking about the context of the word that the phone and phoneme is in, and then how that determines how that word's going to be pronounced. So what did he mean? The first professor meant that phones are the physical production of a sound in the language. It can be described by how it is made and can be measured on a spectrogram. A phone is something that everybody in every language can all make phones. It's just a sound. It's the vibration. It's the tongue movement. It's the mouth. It's the mouth form. It's the form of the mouth. It's all of that. That's not what a phoneme is. That's just the actual sound that's being produced by your mouth and your throat and all of that stuff. The other professor, like I already said, by context, he didn't mean guessing. He meant that the environment in which the word lives determines how to pronounce it. And so I'm going to show you that right now, I believe. Yes. Okay. So we're just talking about speaking right now. We're talking about how when we speak a phoneme and then we all understand it in the English language as a specific phoneme, but it actually comes out as a different phoneme. So there's the underlying phoneme and then there's the surface phoneme. And how this impacts spelling. But right now we're not talking about spelling. We're just talking about what a phoneme is and how the way we pronounce a word is affected by all of the other phonemes around it. So we have what's called the phonological rule, and you have this kind of equation here. And if you have ever studied structured word inquiry, this might look like a word sum a little bit, but it's not a word sum. It is the phonological rule. And so what the phonological rule is that the A represents the target, which is the underlying phoneme that changes. So I'm going to give you examples, so don't worry. And then the B represents the change, which is the surface form or allophone that results. So if you have a phoneme that you think you're saying, and then it comes out just a little bit different because of the environment that it's in, that's what this equation is going to show you. So C and then the underscore D represents the environment in which the context in which oops, I said in which twice, in which the context in which the change occurs. That's the cold kicking in. I can't even talk. The underscore marks where the A appears. So this means that A is going to change to B in the environment of CAD. So that means that the A is in between C and D. And so that's what's going to cause the change from A to B. I'll show you an example. I'll show you a couple examples. C is the sound or context before the A. D is the sound or context after the A. If you see a hashtag, that is a word boundary, and in some cases it's a syllable boundary. And then that line means that A becomes B. So if you're into structured word inquiry, they say that this is rewritten as, but this is just a phonological rule. This is just speaking. So this arrow means because with the phonological rule. Okay, I was just checking the questions. All right. Oopsie. Sorry. So here are a few examples. The flapping. So when we say butter, unless you are, and you might be, and here in North America, we don't say butter. We say butter. We flap it. So I'm using North American English. So what this means is that we think, so the underlying phoneme is t, right? That's the original underlying phoneme, but it becomes d when it's in the environment of being between two vowels and the second syllable of the second vowel is not stressed. So butter, letter, I can't think of any others off the top of my head. Butter and letter are two examples where the T changes, but the spelling doesn't. And remember, I'm not forgetting that this is a spelling presentation. So it's important for you as an instructor or a teacher or whatever your involvement in this is to understand why they're doing it. So, to teach them that, what, I know that it sounds like duh, and I know that you would love to spell it B-U-D-R, but we can't do that because the underlying T is just changing, but the spelling is not. And I think that's really important for them to understand. In that right-hand column, I did use IPA, but I also used just regular kind of education ease phonology on the right hand side, but in the square brackets is the IPA, are the IPA symbols. So let me check the questions real quick. All right. So I always say if there are no questions, it either means I'm doing a really good job or a really bad job, and I always just tell myself I'm doing a really good job. So then we have the example of aspiration. So we have the t, right? So we have T. We all think we're saying t, right? But that becomes aspirated if it is the beginning of a word that is also followed by a vowel. So it's a voiceless stop. So this only works for p, t, k. So those three sounds become p, t, k at the beginning of a stressed syllable, which is typically at the start of a word. So here's an example. We have top, top. So that t in top because t in top. And you can test this by saying top, top. And you can feel that aspiration on your hand. Now say stop, stop. And you can't feel that aspiration on your hand because that's not the same environment. It's the same phoneme. So we mentally think that's the same phoneme, but we are changing the way we're pronouncing it based on what's around it. Again, this is not something I would sit and have a conversation with my student unless they were really interested in it. It's really important for you to know why they might be misspelling something and not understanding it. And you can tell them, look, sometimes the way it sounds changes, but the spelling doesn't change. And sometimes the meaning doesn't change. So if you aspirate something in Thai, that's going to change the meaning of the word, but it's not going to happen in English. So that's what a phoneme is. The question is, if you were giving the word to a student to spell, do you pronounce it butter or butter? Butter or butter? Well, I pronounce it butter because I have the philosophy. It depends on where you are. If you're in the UK, I'd pronounce it butter, right? But here, I pronounce it butter because nobody else is going to overpronounce the word for them. So I'd rather really have them understand how to spell butter and how to say butter and understand why it's spelled that way. I get wanting to overpronounce it because we all want our students to be successful. We're all guilty. We've all done it. But I'm just more, like I said, from the mindset that nobody else is going to do that for them. And my whole goal is to have independent spellers. So here's one more example. You can have a s, but that s turns into z when it is followed by a voiced sound. So in the word dog, g, 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 g is voiced, right? And so you have to, so it becomes z, but the spelling doesn't change. And then we have cats, cats becomes, and it stays the same because it is an unvoiced consonant before this sound. So far, so good. I'm going to assume we're good so far. And then I want you to know that I am going through this quickly, but you have the handouts, and then you also have access to this video that you can watch over and over. And I did make these slides a little wordy so that you can use them as a resource later. So let's have the ED, the past tense allomorph. So again, so many of our students will spell the word, let's see, the word kissed. K-I-S-S-D, kissed. No, sorry, K-I-S-S-T, right? But we want to tell them why it's not T. And one of the ways we can do that, and that's not on this slide, it's on the later slide, is to, instead of say, what do you hear, you're going to say, what are you trying to spell? If you're, oopsie, I keep doing that. If you're trying to spell the past tense, then it's more than likely you're going to have an ED. You don't need to have access to the slides right now. You can just use them. You can look at them later. I was just answering a question. Okay. So here again, using this phonological rule, the suffix is pronounced as id, which is a separate syllable when the verb ends in an alveolar stop in either a t or a d. And again, you don't need to know all these terms. It's just important for you to have the concept in your head of why it's happening. So the rule is that d, so we're assuming the underlying phoneme is d for the past tense, turns to id when it's followed by a t or d, and it's at the end of a word. So that hashtag is the end of the word. So the past tense suffix underlying d becomes id, and the environment following t or d at a morpheme boundary. I personally think this would be kind of fun to make these equations with students and maybe give them words so that they can figure out what the context is, so they can also see how the spelling's not changing even though the pronunciation is. Okay. So there's some examples are want goes to wanted and need goes to needed. And then we have rule 2, which is the allomorph. And this suffix is pronounced when the verb ends in a voiceless, no vocal vibration consonant, such as p, k, f, s, sh, ch. This is This is an example of assimilation where the suffix takes the voicing quality of the preceding sound. So if you're really well versed in Norton Gillingham, you probably all know all of this, but I think it's kind of cool to put it in the word sum so that you can see it. So the d becomes t when it's followed by a voiceless consonant, and then it's also at the end of a word. So examples are walked, kissed, and washed. And then the last one is the suffix is pronounced as d, following any voice sound, including all vowels, diphthongs, and voiced consonants. So there's no change here. The d stays d when it's followed by a voiced consonant, and some examples are loved and played. I'm just checking the questions. Thank you. 1 second. Brittany, do you think could you post the PDF for them, please? Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about language. Let's get more into the linguistics because it's so exciting. Language is all about probabilities. So if you've ever taken a linguistics class, they talk a lot about probabilities. Linguistics is pretty mathy. There's lots of equations in linguistics. So I think it's also important for us to have a conversation with you, and then maybe you have a conversation with your student about probabilities. So spelling in any language is not purely arbitrary. It follows probabilistic patterns. And this means that certain letter sequences, sound to letter mappings, or orthographic choices occur more frequently, are therefore more predictable. On the right-hand side, you have a formula that I am not going to get into because I am not going to say I'm an expert in that theory, but this is the theory that explains the probability in language, probably other things as well. But some examples of that in English, the sequence QU almost always represents QW, sorry. So the probability of Q followed by U is extremely high. Most students who don't have dyslexia, kind of understand this pretty easily. CK is highly likely after a short vowel, but almost never appears at the start of a word. And I would say it never appears at the start of a word in English. And these patterns are learned implicitly by native speakers and explicitly by English learners and probably by struggling learners. Linguists often study them using corpus. I can't see what that says. Counting how often the certain spellings occur. And so what those corpus things are big databases of how language is used in newspapers and books and things that are transcribed. And then you can see how often things are really used in real language. All right. So here's a little bit more about the probabilities in phonology. STR, I have a hard time saying that one, is a frequent word initial cluster. So learners perceive as an valid onset. In morphology, most English past tense verbs use ed, so learners expect ed for new verbs. I want to, and a verb is usually highly probable in that situation. So syntax guides expectation. Salt and pepper is the most probable, so context shapes meaning. And QU almost always follows by a U, and orthography follows probability too. So there's a lot of probability in language, which is really an interesting concept to teach our students to really start looking for the things that occur the most. And then hopefully that will give them an idea of what works and what doesn't. Obviously, there's always going to be quote unquote crazy English words that you have to talk about differently. But I think it's good for students who are struggling to know that there's a sense and that there's some kind of like sense and structure to all of this to help them be a little less frustrated. Okay, lots of questions about the PDF. Okay. Okay, so what is a phoneme? A phoneme, whenever I ask this, people always say it's a sound. I'm like, really? Is it a dog barking? Is it a book dropping? What kind of sound is it? You have to be more specific. A phoneme is the smallest unit of speech in a word that affects meaning. We can't forget that part, affects meaning. The phones b and p contrast in identical environments and are considered to be separate phonemes. So they're in the same environment. They both have ad after them, but because we changed that one phoneme, we changed the meaning of the word. And each language has its own phonemic inventory. So this presentation is only about the English language. We're only talking about the phonemic inventory that as English learners, as English language speakers, we have agreed on. So we have all agreed intrinsically that we have specific phonemes that we all understand and that we all use. Okay, phonetics is the study of all speech sounds and is applicable to all languages, how humans produce sounds, how they are transmitted physically. So I already talked about this earlier, but phone is a distinct speech sound. It's a distinct speech sound. It's not just a sound, it's a speech sound. And phones are studied in phonetics and deal with the physical production and reception of sound, which I already spoke to you about earlier. So I did create this little umbrella picture which shows a phoneme mental representation, because phonemes are a mental representation, because as I showed you in the phonological rule, they change based on their environment. So a phoneme is what we think we're saying. We might think we're saying t in top, but we're really saying t in top. But we don't really realize that because we're just speaking very quickly. So here's an umbrella that shows the p phoneme. And so when we have p at the beginning of a word and it's followed by a vowel, it is aspirated. If we have it at the end of a word, it makes a different sound. Tap, tap. We don't really say tap. We say tap. And then in spit, it's just p, spit, spit. So these are all the different phoneme representations. So they're called allophones, and they're the phonetic realization based on the environment that they are working in. Okay. Thank you, Brittany. All right, I'm going to keep going. So this, oopsie, my mouse is not cooperating today. This is just another graphic of the same concept I was telling you about. So I won't go over it again, but this is just with the T, or the T. I keep doing that. It's not a T, it's a T. Okay, so another concept to teach our students, ourselves, and the people around us are that we spell with graphemes, not letters. So a grapheme is a letter or a group of letters that represent a phoneme. In the word chip, there are 4 letters, but there are 3 graphemes. So the 4 letters are C-H-I-P, and the 3 graphemes are C-H-I-P, C-H-I-P. In the word chips, there are 5 letters, C-H-I-P-S, and 4 graphemes, C-H-I-P-S, and 2 morphemes, chip plus S. So, it's really helpful to remind students that we're working with graphemes, not in letters. So it'd be kind of cool in classrooms to not have letter walls, but instead have grapheme walls. Here's another example. Just kind of gave you some color-coded example of what I already talked about in chip with the letters versus the graphemes. And then in batch, there are 5 letters, but there are only 3 graphemes. B-A-T-C-H. B-A-T-C-H. And, structured literacy really kind of mandates, whether it's research-based or not, that we do everything in a multisensory way. And so batch would be B-A-T-C-H or B-A-T-C-H. B-A-T-C-H. And when you do that TCH with one tap, that's really helping them remember that, oh, that's TCH. That's one grapheme, and that's all together, and that'll help me remember it. And then again, another example with the word stretch, there are, well, this says 4 letters, but that's clearly wrong. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 letters, and there are 5 graphemes. So this is a test really to see if you could catch all my mistakes. S-T-R-E-T-C-H. S-T-R-E-T-C-H. And then there are also 4 phonemes. St, etch. I see that there's a lot of comments about the PDF. If you don't get your PDF during this presentation, I will send it out to everybody who registered as soon as we're done. So don't stress about it too much. And then I'm sure that if you are an educator, a lot of you are familiar with Elkonin boxes. Elkonin boxes are a great way to show how what we pronounce versus what we spell is different, and that sometimes we shift the way we pronounce something, but that doesn't mean we're shifting the way we're spelling it. So in IPA, the word catch would have those symbols, it would have those phonemic symbols, and then the graphemes would be shown. So they can do this for each word, so they can see, you know what, I did pronounce this way, but this is how I spell that sound. This is how I spell that sound in this environment. So like if the word was catches, that would be really interesting because the IPA symbol would show kind of an is, catches, but I don't spell it like IZ. I spell it with ES, and then have a whole conversation about why is it ES and not IZ. And then that's where you really have to get back to meaning and grammar, because we don't spell things IZ at the end of a word. And if we're trying to do something, we're trying to spell something that's a verb, like she catches the ball, it's almost always an ES. So that would be a good conversation to have around that. And that's why this visual is so important. Okay, I'm going to stop and look at the questions. You mentioned that a phoneme is the smallest unit of speech in a word that affects meaning. Would that be a morpheme? No, a morpheme and a phoneme are different. So a phoneme is a single unit. So if the phoneme was like b and d, that's a grapheme. That's not a morpheme. A morpheme is a whole word or part of a word. So the morpheme would be different, although the morpheme also has allomorphs, and that can also change the meaning of a word. And we'll get to that. That's a great question. I'm just looking at all the questions. I shouldn't miss anything. All right. And then you can illustrate that with letter cards. This is the deck we have at Dyslexia Training Institute that has the graphemes on the front and all the phoneme options on the back. So it won't just say S's like in snake. Instead, it will say S and have all the options for S and then different examples of them. And then we're going to get into the English writing system now. So we're going to move away from all of the jargony linguistics and really get into some different stuff. Do you guys have any questions that I haven't answered before I move on to this? All right. Like I said, I'm just going to assume I'm doing an awesome job. All right. So it's really important, especially when it comes to spelling, especially when it comes to pronouncing a word, that you realize that the English writing system is morphophonemic. What that means is that our writing system is not based on syllables. Our writing system is based on morphemes. And when we have a morpheme, like a word, let's say the word is please, like you have the example in front of you. The word is please. When we pronounce the word please, we have that p, o, e, z. So ea is making the E sound. I hate to say it that way. That's the way I'm going to say it right now. And that S is making the Z sound, right? Please, right? But we spell it with an S and we spell it with an EA. Fine. But now I'm going to add a different morpheme and I'm going to change the word and I'm going to add the morpheme URE. And now I've made the word pleasure. So what's happened now is that I added a morpheme and then the phonology of the word has shifted. So it's gone from please to pleasure. So please, which had the long E, is now a short E, and Z went to zh, just because I added another morpheme. So that's what morphophonemic means, is when you add another morpheme, you add another word part, that word might change its phonology, but it doesn't change its spelling. And I'm going to say that over and over because I think it's a really important concept to really teach our students. And with this understanding, we can remove the load from the common weakness of memory and processing speed and transfer it to the problem-solving strengths. So instead of constantly having them to memorize one word and, a whole list of words that they don't even relate to each other, instead you could have them memorize or study or try to understand a whole word family. And by word family, I don't mean at, bat, cat, fat, sat. That's not a word family. That's a rhyming family. A word family would be like what you see here with please, pleasant, pleasure, unpleasant, pleasures. And then have them notice all the different phonology changes. Maybe use Elkonin boxes. Maybe even use those phonology equations I showed you. Like when does EA turn into eh? How does that happen? What is the environment? And then so they can really see that, look at all of these different ways we say this word, but we never change the spelling. And that's, it's a good realization for them to really understand that. Okay. So the English language is built with morphemes. Like I already said, it is not built by syllables. So a morpheme is a minimal distinctive unit of a word that carries meaning and a sense of, I keep covering my slide with the panelists, sense of the word structure. This includes bases, prefixes, suffixes, and connecting vowels. So here are some examples, I should say. Cats has two morphemes. CAT, cat plus S is, and then if you want to use structured word inquiry language, this is rewritten as, I tend to use becomes just because of the phonology, but CAT plus S becomes cats, and there's two morphemes, cat plus S. Playing also has two morphemes, play plus ing, and then actively has three morphemes, ACT plus IVE plus LY becomes actively. Affixes. So an affix is suffix, a prefix, or a connecting vowel. We're not going to talk about connecting vowels here, but a suffix or a prefix. An affix is a bound morpheme that is fixed onto the base of another affix. So prefixes and suffixes don't behave on their own. You don't get anything on their own. They have to be added and fixed onto another morpheme in order for them to work. I was going to say be worthy, but that's probably not the right term. So an example for in the word active, the suffix obviously is IVE. In reactive, the prefix is RE plus ACT, and then the suffix is IVE. And that's a bound. So that's a bound morpheme. I want to talk to you a little bit about how etymology can impact spelling. I'm not going to say that word to you up there, CHOM. I'm going to use my experience doing this in person and tell you that if I said, how do you pronounce this word? Most of you would say it's chom. The word's chom. I'm like, okay, that might be the most probable. We were talking about probabilities earlier. That's probably the most probable for the CH. But what else could it be? It could be sham, and it could be com, like in chemistry, like in machine. The problem is we don't know because this is a nonsense word. So we don't know how to pronounce this word until we know the etymology of the word. We have to know where this word came from in order to know how to pronounce it. So, if you are going to do an assessment and you are going to have somebody spell nonsense words, you need to make sure that you don't count them off if you say the word is sham and they say ch and you want an sh. You don't know. That cannot be a wrong answer. So I think it's really important that as assessors and if you are doing anything like that as for progress monitoring, that you're really making sure that they're not marked off for something that actually might be correct. I'm just checking the questions and answers after pretty much every slide. All right. Okay. So the words base and root are often used interchangeably. A root is the historical origin of a word. Words of the common root have the same etymological origin. Let me try that again. Words of the common root have the same etymological origin, but may not have the same base in present day English. So the base is the current day usage and spelling of a word, and the root is the historical use of the word. So we work in bases because we're working in the present day spelling of words. So then we talk about bases. A base is the current spelling of an English word. They can be either bound or free. A free base is a word like ACT, which can be a word all by itself. I went to act on my own. But then you have a bound base like STRUCT that cannot be by itself. I would not use the word struct on its own. You have to add another morpheme in order for that to be a word, which makes it a bound base. Thank you, Brittany. So Brittany is leaving, but I will be checking the chat box. So now we're going to move on to the schwa. I love the schwa. And I'm going to tell you why I love the schwa. I love the schwa because once I didn't love the schwa. And once I was very intimidated by the schwa. And even though I had all this training in structured literacy in Orton Gillingham, I really didn't feel like I understood it. I didn't feel like I was really given enough information about it. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to learn everything I can about the schwa. And I'm really glad I did, because without understanding the schwa, you can't really understand how English works, especially spelling. And if a student doesn't have a good understanding of our stress-timed language and stress and all of that, that's why they're going to continue to misspell things. So English is a stress-timed language. That means if you want to speed up in English, you close the distance between stressed syllables. And we do this by reducing the unstressed syllable, which results in a schwa. Hang on one second for me. If you were late to the presentation, I did mention at the beginning I have a little bit of cold, so I apologize. Some languages are syllable timed, like Spanish, where each syllable is roughly the same length, given the impression of a steady rhythm. So if you want to speed up in Spanish, you shorten the length of all the syllables. English has a tendency to delete a syllable with a schwa. So most of us say caramel. I know a lot of us say caramel, but I say caramel. So for me, I'm going to delete that syllable. We say separate. I know that some of us will say separate. I say separate. Then we have different. Again, some people will say different. We have different, and one way to show somebody where the schwa isn't different is to say, well, what's a smaller word? I don't want to say a smaller word because I don't. That kind of goes to something else, but that comes from the word differ. And actually, you can take it all the way down to FER if you want. But in this presentation, we're going to take it down to differ. And when you take it down to differ, now the student understands why there's an ER in the middle because they're like, oh, that's right. It's built on the word differ because if you're different, you differ. Okay, so I know that there's an ER in there. I just don't say it in the word different because English does that. It goes quickly. And then we have chocolate where that O just drops off. A question. When we teach a new word, should we get students to identify number of sounds, number of graphemes, number of morphemes? Absolutely. No. And thank you. Okay, so the question is when we teach a new word, should we get students to identify number of sounds, number of graphemes, number of morphemes all together so there's word consciousness that's developed? Is it too overwhelming? First of all, I love the fact that you use the term word consciousness. But yes, absolutely. I think you can start really small. You can start really small. You can start with the word cat and then start with the word cats. I think it's really important for them to see that. And then that if you start small, they won't ever become overwhelmed because they're going to understand it. It's really not that complicated. So once they start to see it, then it won't be too overwhelming. I wouldn't start with something really complicated. I would start with something really basic. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about, we're talking about spelling. Why do our students spell the word kitten like KITN? Why do they spell startle START? A lot of it has to do with the schwa because L, R, M, and N are all what we call syllabic consonants. So when we are saying a word like kitten, that that N consonant already has a schwa-ish to it. And the only reason there's an E there is because we have to have a vowel in that spoken syllable. So in order to have a vowel in the spoken syllable for startle, and the ol already has kind of that schwa attached to it, a little like mini schwa attached to it, then we have to add that E there in order to have a vowel in the spoken syllable, which is really important for them to remember. And it's actually more important for you to understand so that when your students are making these mistakes, you understand why they are making these mistakes, and then you can try to explain it. It's also really important to show them the phonology and however you want to do it. You want to use IPA or you want to use like phonic symbols so they can see the difference in the pronunciation and the spelling. I think that's one of the most important things we can do. All right, so here are just some more examples of what I was saying. As far as how the schwa can cause problems, I'm sure a lot of you have seen a lot of students spell things this way, and it is because of the schwa. It's because they're just sounding it out. They're doing exactly what we tell them to do, and they're sounding it out, and they're hearing things that that I don't want to say that aren't there, but they don't know how to spell the schwa. So for a word like playful, that's actually they usually just add an L to that one. Let's do what's a good one? Let's do hospice. So in hospice, you might talk about what is that HOSP. Can you think of other words that have that word hospice? Or maybe it's hospital, hospitality. So how do we, how do we spell is at the end of a word? Do we usually spell it IS? Usually not. And then when we add an ICE suffix to a word, what kind of word are we making it? And what does ICE mean grammatically in a word? And that's another conversation we can have to help them understand that everything isn't spelled the way it sounds, but sometimes we really have to think about the meaning and the grammar and the function of what we're adding to a word. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the schwa and function words. So function words can have two different pronunciations. In spoken English, there's a citation form and a reduced form. The citation, oops, gosh darn it. The citation, okay, enough of that. The citation form of a word is the pronunciation shown first in the dictionary transcription. It is the pronunciation used when the word is spoken alone or out of context. So citation form pronunciation is less common than the reduced pronunciation of function words. So a lot of times we will teach the, of, was is, the and of as the, let's say the, and to. Those we teach those as sight words, right? They're not really spelled like they sound, but they are. If you say, I went to the party of the year, I went to the best store I've ever been to. If you really enunciate it, or I'm sorry, you stress it in a word, but that's really uncommon. So the reason that those words are schwad, and almost all of them are schwad and completely reduced, is because those are the not the quote unquote important parts of the sentence. So within a connected text, when I say I was going to the party, I was going to the party, I was going to the party. It's actually I was going to the party. I did it the wrong way. To the party. There we go. Um, those function words are schwad. So that is stress in English. And that's why those can be hard for our students to understand how to spell, because we never really fully pronounce them in connected text. And then she was going to the party. She was going to the party. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second as well. Okay, so checking the questions. All right. So another way to find the schwa, and here's a practical activity, is I call it schwa shifting. So let's go look for the schwa shifting in a word. The word photo is a really good example, because if we just use the word photo, there isn't a schwa in the word photo. But if we add photograph, there's also not a schwa. Photograph. There's a schwa in photograph. The second syllable. So now that O is schwa a little bit. Photograph. But we don't say photograph, we say photograph. And then we have photographer, and there's also a schwa on that, but it's shifted to a different syllable. So it's, you want to make sure that you're using either the IPA symbols here, or you can use the phonics symbols if you want, so that they can see how the stress is changing based on what you're adding to the word, but the word isn't changing the spelling, which is the most important part. All right. So another practical idea to help students see why things are spelled the way they are is to play with the accent falling on somewhere else in order to illustrate where it does fall. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this is really hard for me to do, but I'm going to try. So you want to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and that way they can hear, that it doesn't sound right if once you put the emphasis on the wrong place. Try not to over enunciate, like I said earlier. My whole point is to make sure that my students can be good spellers on their own. I don't think people are going to over enunciate for them out in the real world. So, I don't want to say the word is every. Instead, I want to say the word's every, but let's talk about, if they misspell, let's talk about why it does have that ER there. And then talk about it comes from, the base word is ever. And then we have president. And then really having a really hard time spelling president, we can talk about the word preside and how, what does a president do? It presides over something. And then I always tell this joke because I was at a conference once and I said, well, we're talking about the word conference. And I said, okay, so what do we do at a conference? And everyone said, sit. I thought that was really funny. What I wanted them to say was confer. And so when you have the word confer, you now know why that ER is there. Because when we say conference, that ER just kind of like falls away. And so a student might spell it without that ER there. All right. So here's another, excuse me, another way to find the schwa. And I'm not going to go over each one of these with you, but I just want to give you an example that you can have in your handout. So you can have the sentence here. You can put the IPA symbols here or the phonics symbols here, and then have them draw a line as they're reading it, or you can read it for them and they follow along. And you can say the dog was famous for walking backwards. And that way they can start to see where the schwa is, and they can make that comparison along with where we speak a little higher, a little louder. And then in the same vein, another way to find the schwa in the stress of a word, also to look at why a word is spelled the way it is to really look for other words in that word family. So if you have the word define, that first DE is schwad, and then we have definitely, and look at that. The first DE is no longer schwad, but the second syllable now has it. And this one has two. So there's primary stress and secondary stress. So they can really see, look, I am not changing the way I'm spelling it, but we are changing the way we're pronouncing it because of how English is put together. Put together is probably the wrong term. Okay, how not to teach the schwa. Don't teach the schwa out of context with words in isolation. You could say, I went to get some produce, or I'm going to produce something. And so you won't know until you use it in a sentence. I'm going to rebel, or I'm going to be a rebel. And I'm going to conduct, or I'm going to have bad conduct. Either one. And then be really careful with your multisyllabic words, especially during assessment, because you have a word there, Lotenal. Although it's probably pretty probable that AL is going to have a schwa, we still don't know because we don't know what the word is, so we don't know how to pronounce it. And therefore, if the student says lotanol instead of lotanol, which is what we would probably say, it's not wrong because it's a nonsense word, so no one knows where that stress goes. All right, so now for the spelling part. We're getting there. We want to talk a little bit about silent letters before I move on. Does anybody have any questions? Should we teach spelling of function words which are often irregular, or should we still point out their sounds? Uh, you know, okay, so let me read the whole question so you can all see it. Should we teach spelling of function words which are often irregular by rote memory, or should we still point out their sounds if they're good sound letter mapping sounds? Okay, so in my experience, most students don't have tons of difficulty with function words. If you want to spell them with rainbow writing and all of that, like the and was and of and to, just by with rote memory, I think that's okay as long as they know why they're not pronounced the way that they're spelled because they're in connected text, and that's just not how we speak. I think that's okay. If you do have function words that do have phoneme grapheme mapping, that's pretty, common. You can do that too, but when it comes to the schwa, you just want to make sure they know why they're underpronounced or pronounced with a schwa, or not stressed, I should say. So let's talk about silent letters. There's the first reason for silent letters, or there's more morphological boundary shifts. So remember that English is morphophonemic. So here are some examples. Again, these are just 3 examples. I know that you can probably think of 100 more. I'm only going to go through these 3 because it's just to give you an idea of how to look for the reason. So the first word is bomb. So why is there a B at the end of bomb? It just seems crazy. But, if you really, instead of saying, it's crazy, you can say, I wonder if there are other words related to that in meaning and spelling that can help us understand why there's a B in it. And sure enough, there's bombard, there's bombardier, and there's bombastic. And I'm sure there are more. But now you know why there's a B there. I could take this further and make sure that, and try to find out which one came first. Did bombard come first and then bomb, or did bomb come first and then bombard, which would be just another step up in the conversation. And then you have the word sign in this. If you've studied structured word inquiry at all, you know this is a lexical matrix, what I will get to at the very end. But in the word sign, why is that G there? Why is G in sign? It seems like a silent, crazy letter. But if you look for other words in the word family, you realize quite quickly that you have words like signal, signature, designate, resignate, signify, all of these words where all of a sudden you're like, oh, the G has to be there. Because without the G, we wouldn't be able to have all of these other words in the word family. And then close. I like this one because I never really thought about close. Like close does have a silent letter. It actually, in that TH is silent, right? But like, when a student spells close, say they say, I had to pick up my clothes, and they spell it CLOS, or maybe they spell it CLOSE, close. We need to teach them why is that TH there? Well, because, clothing, you have clothing, which has the TH, you have clothed and cloth. And what are clothes made out of? Clothes are usually made out of cloth, right? Or at least, maybe they used to be, or that's how they started. You know what I mean? So I would probably go back into the etymology to see which one came first. Did cloth come first and then we said clothes? Clothes come first and then we say cloth. But the point is the student now understands that there has to be a TH there because it is related to all of these other words. Right, so reason 2 for silent letters is a printing press and identity crisis. And I did not come up with that term. That came from an article written by O'Krent in 2022. And she stated when the printing press was invented, English spellings were being chosen. And during this time, many printers chose to reincorporate letters from old versions of words to make them seem more sophisticated. So I'm not sure this is one example of she was talking about, but this is one example of a silent letter marking its meaning. So why is there an L in yolk? Because that actually, the yellow part of the interior of an egg is distinguished from the white middle-aged yolk from Old English. I'm not even trying to read that yolk. Etymologically, the yellow part. So that L is there because it means yellow. So that's why the L is there. Fun things for students to understand. And then we have could, would, and should. And so would has that. Why do they all have these L's in there? Why it just seems quote unquote crazy. Because would is related to will, should is related to shall, and then they did it with could because it sounds just like would and should, and so they use an analogous spelling. Again, so it's a good real linguistic story to tell a student that will help them remember it instead of trying to remember it by rote memorization. There's my dog. My husband's home, so there's my dog. Okay. I'm going to pause for 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. My dog has some issues. All right, so we want to talk about understanding silent letters. And then I won't read this to you. This is from my book, Dyslexia and Spelling, but it's just an explanation of why some silent letters are orthographic markers and some of them are etymological markers. And that's important for you to know. So the question is, how do we explain silent letters in walk and talk? I knew somebody was going to ask me that. Those are really hard. Remember, at the very beginning, I said I'm not going to be able to answer all of the questions. I can tell you that talk is related to tell. So that's why there's an L in talk. I cannot remember the one about walk, but we can definitely look it up. It's all over the internet, and it's a great question. And it's also a fun question to dig into with your learners because most of the dictionaries will tell you the answers to those questions. So I'm glad you asked the question because that's exactly what I was hoping you would do. All right, so reason number 3 are marker letters. So English spellings often include marker letters to make the reader aware of either a phonological shift or prevent particular spelling pattern. So here are some reasons for silent letters, like the silent quote unquote E or the all the different crazy names we have for the single silent E. So in English, we never end a word in V ever. So love, have, give, shove, dove, all of those words have an E on the end of them because we just don't end a word in V. Blue because we don't end a word in U. And dense because it's a plural canceling marker. So without this E here, we would have the plural of den, like all of the bears went into their dens for the winter. And then bathe, if you take the E off, what do you have? You have bath, right? So in bathe and teeth, you have this change in phonology because you add that E here, and you also have a change in grammar. And so then we have the reason for, which is an etymological marker. So in the word to, we have that W in there, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. And some of you probably already know. And then in people, why is that O there? It's these crazy words that our students get so frustrated with. Okay, so in 2, the questions that I want you to ponder are what do you call 2 children born on the same day to the same mother? When you do something a second time, you've done it twice. In the first answer to the first question was twins. 2 times 6 is 12. 2 times 10 is 20. When there are 3 people lined up, the one in the middle is between the others. The period of time in the evening when you're between daylight and darkness is referred to as twilight. So if I were with a student, I would have asked them all of these questions and I would have written this all down and then I would have said, what did you learn? And they would have said, hopefully, that, oh, they're all spelled with TW. And then I would ask them more questions and they would say, oh, they're also all related to the number 2. They all have something to do with 2 and they're all spelled with TW. So that W is there as an etymological marker to mark its connection to all of these other words. So 2 isn't crazy. It's not there because we want spelling to be really difficult. It's there because it is historical context. All right. I'm going to keep moving along because I think I put quite a bit in this presentation. Checking your questions. Okay. So what does grammar have to do with it? A lot. And I think that we really miss an opportunity to not teach grammar with spelling. Oh, I'm sorry, people. You're right, Jennifer. People's related to population. I can't believe I forgot to put that in there. So, what is a population made out of? It's made up of. It's made up of people. And so that's why that O is there to mark its connection to population. Okay, so grammar has a lot to do with spelling. Teaching spelling independent of grammar is a misrepresentation of how English spelling works. We want to talk about form and function. What is about the spelling that what is it about the spelling that identifies the grammatical form? And then the function is how is it functioning in the sentence? So we have form and function. And here's just a quick side note about what it's not to, I've said this a couple times already, but don't ask what do you hear, ask what are you trying to spell. And this really matters when it comes to grammar. We all pronounce things differently, and that's okay. If I've heard so many people, I've had people email me say, I just have the student and they just can't pronounce it the way I want them to pronounce it too. And anyone with linguistic training will know that your first question will be, well, did you understand what they said? And if you do understand what they're saying, then there's no problem. But if it's causing them an issue with spelling, then you need to change what you're asking. You don't want to change the way they pronounce it. You want to say, well, what are you trying to spell, and how do we spell that? So instead, you want to ask what meaning and their function are you trying to spell? There's not a correct way to pronounce a phoneme. There's not just a specific way to pronounce any phoneme. People come from all over the world and they have all different ways to pronounce phonemes. But if we all understand what word they're saying, then that's okay. When it starts to impact their spelling, that's when we start to have a different conversation. All right. So caution, without context, confusion is ahead. So let's talk about the Jabberwocky. If you're familiar with the Jabberwocky, it uses a lot of nonsense words. I'm not going to read the Jabberwocky to you. Instead, I'm going to give you an example of the part of the Jabberwocky that I took. And then I'm going to have a talk about form and function. So, 'twas brillig and the slithy toves. All nonsense, kind of, right? I'm not an English major, so if you are and you're dying to tell me I'm wrong, that's okay. But I'm just talking about spelling here. So in this text, it's pretty obvious that slithy is an adjective, right? So, or it could be slithy, who knows? And so it's L-I-T-H plus suffix Y. So that's the form. And the function is that it's describing toves. So the suffix Y is adding meaning. The following is characterized by, and that means it's an adjective. And it can't be spelled E-E-E or E-Y in this context. So even if it's slithy, it can't be because it's an adjective, and that's not how we spell adjectives. And then a Y suffix does not always denote an adjective. So an example, an army and baby. But you have to make sure that you're kind of preempting a lot of this by saying, most of the time the probabilities is that it will spell an adjective. I'm not even sure that's correct in that situation. All mimsy were the borough groves and the mome raths outgrabe. So what are mimsy? What does mimsy mean? Huh. Well, the form is mims plus suffix y. It's describing the borough groves. Okay, all mimsy were the borough groves, right? So it's describing the borough groves. The y is adding the meaning by following the characterized by. It's a grammatical text. Class in this context is an adjective, and it cannot be spelled these ways. So again, just another fun example to use with your student about what the form is, what the function is, instead of asking them what the sound is. And then we have before the jub bird and shun the frumious bandersnatch. And this is a fun one because OUS is such a common suffix and so hard for our students to spell. The form is frumious. The function is describing the bandersnatch. OUS is adding the meaning. The following having full of. Its grammatical class again is an adjective. It cannot be spelled US or OS. And it's something that would, if you sound it out, that's what you might end up with. So a challenge question for you and your students, can you think of an OUS word that's not an adjective? Or perhaps you can think of a word that can work as both an adjective and a noun with an OUS suffix. Can you think of one that's not an adjective with OUS? I'm going to keep going. If you think of one, let me know. Okay. Oh, I did these twice. Sorry about that. The Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood and burbled as it came. So the the form is whiffle plus ing, whiffling. The function is describing the action of the Jabberwock. The ing is adding the meaning of often denoting completed habitual action. It's a verb, and it cannot be spelled any other way. The challenge question for you is, can you think of an ing word that is not a verb, or perhaps can you think of a word that can work as both a verb and a noun? So if you can think of any words and an ing that is not a verb or can work as a verb and a noun, go ahead and put it in the chat box. Did it again. I doubled on this. I don't know how that's happening. Okay. I did it again. Oh, because we did burbled. That's right. That makes sense. Okay. So burbled, here's the form. Burble plus ed. And that, this is a good conversation to have about which e drops off here. Is it this e or is it this e? It's actually the first e that drops off when you are adding a vowel suffix. It describes the past action of the Jabberwock. The ed is adding the meaning. The following words often denoted completed or habitual action. It's a past tense verb. Cannot be spelled for all those reasons we went over when we went over the phonological rule, right? So now you can put this back in the phonological rule and we can have a conversation about the context of the word. And then another challenge question for you. Can you think of an ed word that is not a past tense verb? Or perhaps can you think of a word that can work as both a verb and a noun? And I gave you an example. The horse is tethered to the pool. The pole. It's tethered. It's currently tethered. So that is not past tense. So there you go. I'm running out of time. I'm just going to keep going. You want to ask, what is the most common way to spell the past tense? So this was my student, and he spelled the word surfed, S-R-F-T. So I would ask him, when did you surf? What did it already happen? And he would say yes. I'm like, okay, what is the most common way that we spell it? Not what do you hear? Because he put down all the phonemes there. He has all the sounds. He has good phonological awareness. What he doesn't understand is that just because the way we pronounce it shifts, our spelling does not. So what is the most common way that we can add the past tense to the word surfed and grabbed, and he will be able to tell me ed and change it. So it's just changing your questions and how you approach your spelling questions with your students. Just a public service announcement that ed is not always past tense. We are headed your way. She was caught red-handed. I said red-headed. Red-handed. And that is a rugged terrain. So all eds, but not past tense. S is not always a plural. She runs in the morning. She takes many runs a week. Trips, before the pandemic, we took many trips by plane. So it's not always, he always trips on that step. T-I-O-N is not a suffix. And it does not, I don't know why it says T-I-O-N. It should say I-O-N. It's not always create a noun. So I can ration the food, or there is a ration of food. I can love to visit the fire station, or we will station the guard at the entrance. And we love to vacation in Hawaii, and we had a lovely vacation. So again, remembering that, we have to be really flexible in our language so that when our students come across something that doesn't seem probable to them, that they can remember that there are different ways to use the grammar parts of a word. This is one way that you can do it in a multisensory way. This is just a picture of sticky notes of different colors. And this is using a word sum that you might find in structured word inquiry that I will show you in a second. You can also use descriptive generalizations. So in linguistics, a descriptive generalization is where you see a pattern and then it's your job to describe it. So how would you describe the pattern? So this is one thing I would do with the student, is I would give them or a group of students, I would give them all of these words and I'd say, okay, you come up with the rule. What is the rule? What do you notice here? I don't want to give it to them. I want them to come up with the descriptive generalization. And they can also do that with this. So what is the rule? When does Y go to I and when doesn't it go to I? And so it's a really good group activity, and it's really good for them to be wrong. And then they can try out a bunch of things until they really get to the final rule. So here's just an example. And then there are the functions of the final E, which again, I'm not going to go over these because they will be in the handout, but just some examples of all the different ways, all the different jobs that the final single syllabic E, non-syllabic E has on spelling. And then it's not just a silent E. It's not just there to make the previous vowel say its name. It does a lot of other things. I wouldn't give this to a student all at once. I wouldn't give them this huge list. We would work through it very slowly. And then again, discover the spelling pattern. So for this, what I did do is had 3x5 cards. And then after we had gone over these and after I knew that they knew them, I would give them the 3x5 cards at the beginning of a lesson and they would just tell me why the E's there. So for example, the first one would be the E's there to be a plural canceling marker because without it, it would be the plural of T. Rice is there to make the C soft. And E in love, the E is there to prevent the word from ending in V. In fudge, it's because we don't have a J at the end of a word, but that E is there to give it the J sound. And then in bathe, it's there to change the phonology of the TH. All right. Again, this goes back to another, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm looking for the word. It's not a word sum. This is a, okay. So anyway, oopsie. I'm gonna come up with the word. But you have the starting state, and then how does it begin, and how does it end, and when, in what environment is it in? So it goes back to that phonological rule, but this is a little bit different. It's more of a spelling rule. So you start with the starting state of it, and then you have the ending state of it, and then in what situation did it change? So an example, the ION becomes sh following a T. This is a picture of my very favorite student. I always say, if people say they don't have favorite students, they're lying. But he was my favorite student, and this is just an introduction to structured word inquiry. And one thing he said to me when he was in 6th grade that nobody had ever said, but it made the most sense was, oh, so the longer the word is, the more meaning it has. Boom, that's it. That's what it is. The more morphemes you add to a word, the more meaning the shifts, and the more meaning you add to a word. He's absolutely right. So if you are interested in something other than Norton Gillingham, there's also structured word inquiry. And what structured word inquiry does is it teaches that the English language is based on the intersection of phonology, morphology, and etymology. And so, like I spoke about earlier, that the fact that English is morphophonemic is really important to understand for everybody, but especially in structured word inquiry. It uses the principles of scientific inquiry. It uses morphology, etymology, and phonology to help a student understand why words are spelled the way they are, but also to help them understand why words are pronounced the way they are. So the question is, are children able to remember so many rules with working memory issues? What are the practical tips to help them overcome? So great question. No, I am throwing a lot at you. I would take this very slowly with a student with working memory issues. However, this is actually taking the strain off their working memory because it's giving them an understanding. They're not having to memorize everything. They're actually looking at words and saying, oh, I can see it. They don't have to memorize it. They can see it, and they can come up with reasons for things instead of having to memorize them. Structured word inquiry is based on 4 questions. So they are, what does it mean? How is it built? What are its relatives? And what aspects of the pronunciation are represented in the spelling? This is a very base level explanation of structured word inquiry. It's just to plant a seed for you and give you another rabbit hole to go down in order to improve any kind of spelling instruction that you might be using. So this is a lexical matrix. You have the base word right here, do. You have its connotation or its meaning down here. You have your prefixes and your suffixes. And if you notice, I actually haven't said the word yet. And I haven't said the word yet because I don't know how I'm going to pronounce that word until I add another morpheme. So on its own, it's a free base. So on its own, it's do. But if I add es, it's does. And now that O has shifted its phonology. So it's do, does, doing, done. And so, that's one thing a student would notice is that, look, the spelling hasn't changed, but the pronunciation has. And then you can also put them into word sums, which are very familiar, very close to the equation I showed you in the phonology shifts I showed you at the very beginning. But here you would say do plus es is rewritten as does does. I usually say do plus es becomes does does. And so that is the multisensory part of it, where they can trace it, they can write it, they can say it, however you want to add that multisensory component. And then you can do the same with the word go. And this is this is all free. You can just get a blank piece of paper and write a matrix on it. You can go to the mini matrix maker online. That's also free. You can do all of these things with your students. You don't hand them the matrix already filled out. You fill out the matrix with them as they come across new words. So you might start with do plus es and doing, and then later on come across done, and then have a whole conversation about whether or not it belongs in that matrix or not. And then here's another one with ACT and all of the different words that you can build on ACT, and they can start to see all the different parts, how the phonology is shifting. So like you have acted versus the phonology in action. So that phonology shifted here, but the spelling did not. Again, I would not give them this whole thing. This is something you would go through with your student, and they would add them as they go. It's kind of a living document. So it's right at 6 o'clock my time. So I have some key takeaways. It's imperative to include the schwa in any and all reading and spelling instruction. You want to make sure you teach grammar and spelling together, and make sure you really are understanding the phonology of words and talking about these things really explicitly with your students. So with that, I'm going to just stop, give you the last slide that just shows you a little more things, some more things that we do at DTI, and then some books that I wrote. This is the one that this presentation is somewhat based on, but I did add a lot of things to this presentation that aren't in that book because that book was starting to get a little old. It is. All right. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.